In this video, we'll talk about fixing mistakes in seed stitch. We'll cover how charts are a valuable knitting tool in helping read where we are in our knitting and what's on our needles. We'll also cover how to change a knit into a purl stitch and a purl stitch into a knit stitch. First up, let's talk about fabric and charts. So for knitting charts, they are a visual representation of the right side of knitting. This here is an example of a stockinette chart. Right side rows and wrong side rows, if we were knitting in the round, would all be knit. If we're knitting flat, we're going to knit right side rows and then purl wrong side rows. That results in a fabric that looks like this. And you can see all of the stitches are smooth and are all V's on the right side of the work. And then on the wrong side of the work, they're all purl bumps. So if we take a look at that compared to the chart, we see that the chart is all knits, and if we look at the surface of the fabric, that is all knits as well. A second example is garter stitch. Garter stitch, if we're knitting in the round, is knitting one row and then purling one row. If we're knitting flat, we're knitting one row, turning the work, and then knitting also on the wrong side row. This is because knit and purl stitches are reverses of each other. If we take a look at a garter stitch fabric, we can see that there are horizontal stripes and the purl bumps line up the same way as they do in the chart. Where if we stretch it out, we can see that we've got alternating knits and purls. So charts are a really good way to be able to visualize what's happening in your knitting. Seed stitch is really just a combination of garter stitch arranged in a different way. If we take a look at what makes garter stitch, it's really these two rows. A knit row and then a purl row in the round, or a knit row and a knit row working flat. We can see that similar 2-row 1-stitch pattern over in seed stitch, and that's what gives us those purl bumps and that nice diagonal pattern on the front of the work. If we look at our seed stitch swatch, we notice we have little garter ridges of 1 stitch at a time, and they go up on a diagonal and kind of crisscross with each other. The same thing happens in the chart. We can see diagonals of knits and purls, and that's what gives seed stitch its distinctive pattern. If we're knitting in the round, we're working seed stitch by going knit, purl, knit, and then on the next row, purling into the knits, knitting into the purls, and purling into the knits. On the following row, we're knitting into the purls, purling into the knits, and knitting into the purls. If we're working flat, we're on the right side going knit, purl, knit, and then on the wrong side, we're going knit, purl, knit. So we're knitting into what looks like a purl stitch on the wrong side. We're purling in what looks like a knit stitch on the wrong side, and we're knitting into what looks like a purl stitch on the wrong side. Charts can be a really helpful tool when we're troubleshooting our knitting and when we're working through rows of knitting. I wanted to show you how I work through a row of knitting and how I use the chart to help me analyze my knitting while I'm going through the work. So for seed stitch, there are multiple things that I'm looking at while I'm working through a row. Let me get to where we would start the chart repeat. So at this point on the needles, when I'm looking to work the next stitch, I'm analyzing a few things. I'm analyzing what stitch I just worked on the needles, what's happening in the column of stitches below the stitch that I'm going to work next, and what's happening with the stitch after the stitch that I'm going to work next. When I'm working from a chart, I can also visualize all of that information and compare it as I'm knitting through the work. So if I take a look at this chart and say that we're starting row 3, what I can look at when I am working that stitch is what stitch is supposed to be below it. Well, on the right side, I should have what looks like a purl stitch or a purl bump. And I can see on my needles there is a purl bump, and that is the stitch that I'm working next. So that's correct. I can also compare the stitches below that stitch, was there another knit stitch, and then if I keep going down from the top of the chart, purl stitch, knit stitch. And I do. I have these nice garter ridges, so I know all of that looks correct. I can also take a look at how this stitch interacts with the next stitch. This stitch, the next stitch, would be a purl, and that purl would be coming out of a knit stitch. So if I look at that stitch, I've got a knit on the needles and I would be purling it. So that would be continuing in the pattern. What I quickly find with seed stitch is that all of the instructions are knitting into purls and purling into knits. So I can very quickly analyze my knitting as I'm working along and maintain the stitch pattern without having to think too much about it. When I see a purl on my needles, which is indicated by having the top of the stitch below it in the front of the work, or facing you, I know that I can knit into that stitch because I'm knitting into the purls and purling into the knits. When I see the next stitch on the needles, I see that it's a knit stitch. It's coming out of a V, or the top of that stitch, the turtleneck, if you will, is hanging out in the back of the work. So that's how I know it's a knit. I want to purl into the knit stitches to maintain seed stitch pattern, and so I'm going to purl into that next stitch. And I can continue that for the rest of the row. So I can knit into a purl stitch here, and purl into a knit, and knit into a purl, and purl into a knit. I've just changed up some stitches to show you what it can look like when we start getting out of pattern in seed stitch. So I just worked a purl stitch on the needle, so I should need to work a knit stitch into the next stitch. Because I know that seed stitch is always worked opposite, I know that I would need to be working into a purl stitch, so I would need to make a knit into a purl stitch. Looking at what I have on my needles though, there's a break in the diagonal pattern, and I have a knit stitch on my needle where I should have a purl stitch. That's okay, it's really easy to fix. And so you can insert your needle from back to front and drop the stitch from the row that was incorrect. At this point, I have a knit and I want to make it a purl. So I'm going to move the strand of yarn that's running between this stitch and this column of stitches to the front of the work because we need the yarn in the front if we're going to purl a stitch. And then I can use that yarn after slipping that stitch over to purl the stitch. So I've just changed a knit into a purl, and I can continue on in pattern. My last stitch on this needle was a purl, and so if I knit into this stitch, I know my pattern is good again. If I look at the next stitch on the needle, I notice a problem as well. I know I need to purl into this stitch because I just knit this stitch. And when I purl and seed stitch, I know that I need to purl into a knit stitch. But this is a purl stitch. So if I look at that, I can evaluate the rest of the column as well and see if there are any other problems. But it looks like the only problem in this row is just that top piece. So I can change this purl stitch to a knit stitch, and I'm going to do that by inserting my needle underneath the ladder from this stitch to that stitch and from back to front through the stitch below it. When I do that, I can remove the ladder, and it's in the back of the work, which is fine because to fix it, we'll be making a purl into a knit. So I can slip that stitch over and then use that extra yarn between the stitches that I pull out to knit the stitch, and then slip that back over to the needle to be worked for the current row. I can purl into it and then keep going on with my row, knitting the purls and purling the knits. If you're feeling very ambitious, you can even do this by dropping down multiple rows. How I like to do that is I identify where I am on my chart. So like for this example, I am knitting row 3, we'll say, and then I figure out where I am in the chart. So here I was about to work a purl stitch, so we'll say that we're here in the middle. If I needed to fix stitches below this, I could mark where I am on the chart. So just mark off that square. And then as I ladder down multiple rows, I can just keep track of the chart where I was at. So the first row I could highlight this one, the next row I could highlight this one, and then I know which actions I need to take coming back up to the current row. In this video, we talked about how we can fix seed stitch, use charts to help us figure out mistakes in our knitting without frogging, and also how to change a knit to a purl and a purl to a knit.